Welcome, baddies, to Called to Be Bad. In this episode, I talk with professor, anti-racist, anti-oppression, and peace educator Regina Shands Stoltzfus, who co-authored the book Been in the Struggle, Pursuing an Antiracist Spirituality with Tobin Miller Shearer. Our primary topic is critical race theory, but we cover other elements of anti-racism and anti-white supremacy work within the world of education and church life. Yeah, so our primary topic is critical race theory, but we also explore other elements of anti-racist spirituality, etc., especially how critical race theory relates to Regina's book. Also, a few things. I will be going live with Anabaptist World Magazine this Monday, the 15th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to talk about the podcast. So if you can't tune in live, don't worry, there will be a recording that you can watch later, but if you can make it live, that would be awesome. And I'm very excited. So yeah. Also, I had the idea to start what I'm calling a baddies council, or a few people that would act as a Called to Be Bad board of sorts. My idea is that we would Zoom once a month and talk about the podcast, what's going well, any ideas for improvement, basically like a support group to help me with motivation, a place to share what's coming up with the podcast, and time where we can bounce ideas around and brainstorm ideas for the podcast. So I have a few people in mind that I might reach out to ask if they want to be on this baddie board, but if you are interested in being in this group, please let me know. Even if we've never talked before, it's totally fine. If you're excited about the podcast, I want you on this baddie board. And feel free to email me if you're interested at calledtobebad@gmail.com, or you can message me on Facebook or on Instagram to let me know. Lastly, I will post 2 bonus clips on the Patreon from this episode. One will be for paying members only, and I'll also have one on there for anybody. And there's other free content, I believe, on Patreon. If there's not, then I'll go put some up there. So go check that out. Okay, bye.
I mean, honestly, I think what's behind a lot of this is we are not going to subject white children to feeling bad about this history, right?
Yeah.
And that is what I certainly have heard people say, well, you're just trying to make me feel bad for being white. No, I just want you to understand like what we have inherited because of this history.
Okay. 1, 2, ready, go.
Welcome to the Called to Be Bad podcast. My name is Mariah Martin, and I feel called to be bad. It turns out I'm not the only one. Join us as we dig into all things bad, scandalous, deviant, the stuff that makes good church folks squirm in the sanctuary. Why? Well, because sometimes the scandalous is spiritual, deviant is divine, and bad is beautiful. Say yes to the call, and let's see what holy trouble we get into today. Hi, Regina.
Hi there.
Welcome to Call to Be Bad.
Thanks. It's good that we finally matched up and got our dates together, and here we are.
Yes. We are talking about critical race theory and how even, more progressive white folks, maybe Christian white folks, still have a hard time talking about race and racism. And yeah, just kind of picking at those topics. But before we dive into all of that, Regina, I'm curious what you are drinking today.
So because it is past 10 o'clock, I am not drinking coffee because I have learned as I get older, that's not a good look for me when I want to sleep at night. I'm drinking water, which is also something that I have learned to do. I think that for many years I was in a state of perpetual dehydration because I was like, I don't need water. Turns out I do. So I drink water and I have a little app where I chart the water so I get a pretty picture at the end of the day. But yeah.
That's awesome. What app is that?
It's called Water Llama. And so you get a cute little animal that you put your drinks in. as you go through the day, and then at the end of the day, it animates a little bit for you. It's very cute, and it's
Okay,
free.
that's really cool. I'm gonna have to check that out. Yeah. I do okay drinking water, but yeah, I could always use more inspiration to drink water. Well, I have coffee. I still fall asleep okay at night. Basically, I think my cutoff for caffeinated coffee is somewhere around like 3 or 4 p.m.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just how my body works. But I normally only go with 1 cup of caffeinated, maybe 1 cup of decaf in during the day. Anyways, and so this mug was given to me by Rachel Stolpe, who lives in Milwaukee, and I visited her in Milwaukee, so she had to give me a Milwaukee mug. Anyway, so yeah, so that is what I am drinking, and I haven't had a sip yet. So before we get in, I'm just gonna like savor my first sip of coffee.
So my mug
We can
is
do.
just
Oh yeah.
women and plants and cups of tea or coffee or whatever they're drinking all
Oh
around.
yeah. Can you hold it up to the camera even closer so
Yeah.
people can see it?
There you
Nice. Oh yeah, I forgot to describe my mug for those listening. It looks like it's like a log from a tree.
go. Hmm.
And it has a map of Milwaukee with like a little heart around. Or no, sorry. It's a map of Wisconsin with a heart around where Milwaukee is.
There you go.
Anyways. Oh, that was a good sip of coffee. I think I'm ready now. Okay, so critical race theory. We always start with definitions, and I'm particularly interested in how you define it because, and it doesn't have to be the textbook definition, although you can provide, if that's helpful for our conversation. But so I'm not in the education world, but from what my friends talk about who are in the education world, the actual definition of critical race theory is not how people are using the phrase. Like it has become a whole other buzzword. So take it
Yeah,
away.
yeah, buzzword, exactly. So the way that I like to talk about it, especially when I'm trying not to use the phrase critical race theory, because it
Mm,
has become such a buzzword now that I don't, why set people off if you don't need to? I think of it in terms
yeah.
of it's the story of how we got here, right? So it emerges out
Mm,
of critical theory and out of legal studies. And so the movement into critical theory starts when scholars, educators, people who are in these various disciplines and conversations begin to acknowledge there really is no objectivity. Like you can't take a subject and say, here is the objective truth of whatever this is. So coming out of legal studies, legal scholars saying, yeah, there's no objective pure truth. There's a context
mhm,
around everything. And so the historical context, and like I said before, the story of how we got here, and the here that I'm thinking about is how are we in the 21st century still thinking about race and having racialized problems when for many of us, myself included, when we were younger, we thought, oh, racism, we're an advanced society. That won't be a problem by the time
mhm,
I have kids. Like that was something that for a period in my life, I thought when I didn't think of it systemically. So thinking about what were the narratives, what is the contextual history, what were the laws that emerged around race that built the setting in which we find ourselves. And I'm thinking we can think about how this works in other countries, but I'm thinking primarily in the US context. because we have such a racialized history, right, that we want to forget about. That's why there's the backlash against critical race theory. We don't want to think about that anymore. But we have such a racialized history, and it helps us understand, for instance, why neighborhoods are persistently segregated, right? So if you ask an 18-year-old undergrad to describe race relations in the town that they came from, what I used to hear a lot would be, well, we didn't really have any race issues in our town. Probe at that a little bit. So why is that? Well, it's an all-white town, so there was nobody to fight with about race. So you probe that a little bit more. So why is it an all-white town? And they probably don't know. But now that the conversation around sundown towns, for instance, is becoming something that's more talked about, like there's a history there, there's a story there. And this is not the only place that story unfolded, that there are places all around the country that at some point in time, the powers that be decided, either by some sort of statute or just by tradition, this is where this group of people will be allowed to live. And then subsequently, this is where this is where the city or the town or the region is going to put these kinds of resources. And so it's a continually unfolding story that always starts with a decision around who can be where or what is possible for groups of people. And those bring in other stories, right? Those bring in other stories about um, what group do I belong to and what are our qualities? What groups are other and what are their qualities? And where do I get that information from? So all of those narratives feed into the what critical race theory is doing, which is thinking about what sorts of laws and traditions have shaped where people live, where they can go to school, how they think about themselves and others, um, and what those legal scholars were doing at that time were trying to figure out discrimination lawsuits, right? So the classic one coming out of critical race theory is a Black woman bringing a discrimination suit to a company that says, well, we hire Black people and we hire women, so really you don't have grounding for this discrimination suit. And what Kimberly Crenshaw looks at is that intersection of, yes, you hire Black men and white women, so this Black woman actually does have standings for her claims. So it's looking at how the interplay of history and context, and then how it lands for people and the groups that they belong to, and helps us understand how to answer questions about that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that it's interesting because at least from just kind of an observer's perspective, not being in the conversations about, can we have critical race theory in curriculums, that the legal element it is what gets lost. That that it was looking at discrimination laws, and you were talking about asking your students where they came from and if there were race problems, and I was thinking about this in preparation for this episode, and I was thinking about my hometown, Glenwood Springs, Colorado, and my school was 51% Latino, Latinx, and I don't remember any other like kids of color. Like it was like the white kids. This is how we thought about it. It was like the white kids and the kids from, well, at the time, unfortunately, we would say like the Mexicans.
Yeah.
Which is just, yeah. anyways, not great. Um, and I was thinking about this, and I was like, wow, there really were like not many other people of color. Why? Why was that the case? There was one woman that went to our church, Gladys, and anyway, she was lovely and very impactful in my growing up. But I was like, why? Why? And so I started looking into it, literally like last night at like 10 p.m. And there are several towns in Colorado that were sundown towns. I didn't find that Glenwood specifically was, but in another bigger city in Colorado Springs, one person was talking about that, like growing up, when people were fleeing from the South and going north or west, when they landed in Colorado Springs, it was almost harder to live there than in the South because they didn't know how to act. They didn't know where to go. They didn't know. And in the South, it was more explicit. Like it was like, this is for whites only, and there would be literal signs. Yes. But in Colorado Springs, it wouldn't be there, but then they would go and then they would face racism. And anyway, so that was kind of, I was like, well, yeah, you wouldn't stay in a place that you're implicitly pushed, like you are implicitly told you don't belong here.
And that's exactly the story of my parents. And in the neighborhood that I grew up in Cleveland, I was born and raised in Cleveland. But my parents and the parents of my friends, my age mates, were mostly part of that great migration from the South to the North and to the West. And so, and my family did exactly what you read about in narratives about the Great Migration. That there were relatives that went before my mom did, and she decided to go, and then she lived with an aunt and uncle for a time until she established herself. And then when my parents started their family, I remember I had aunts and uncles that would come up from down south, and then they would live with us for a time until they got themselves situated. And this was replicated in households all over my neighborhood, that migration of people. And exactly as you've said, one of the reasons that people follow family members is because whoever goes first, like, they send back the message, okay, it's okay here. I found work. I found a place to live. But what you described about the difference between the more subtle and the more explicit racism, I do remember my mom telling me stories about that very definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like along this line of storytelling, if you have any stories as an educator, you lead anti-racism trainings. If you have any stories about trying to introduce critical race theory or trying to talk about these topics, like why is this a bad topic for you? Like kind of your personal connection to this topic.
Yeah, so I lovingly put the blame on what some people think is my obsession with thinking about race and anti-racism and race relations. I lovingly lay the blame on that on my home congregation in Cleveland, which was an interracial congregation, predominantly Black for most of its experience. We moved into the neighborhood that we moved into. We were invited to church by the family that lived on the street behind us. And it was a Mennonite church, but it didn't have Mennonite in the name. It was part of a group of churches that were started in the 40s and 50s, where Mennonite seminary graduates or voluntary service workers would go into an urban area, and some churches were planted there. And our church got its start that way. It was in a Black neighborhood. And so for me, my normal growing up was that Black and white people could go to church together because I experienced it every week, week in and week out.
Mm-hmm.
And the backdrop of that was, so I was a child in the 60s, a teenager in the 70s. And so the backdrop, especially for my childhood, was the civil rights movement and stories of riots and Martin Luther King and all of these things. And so putting those things together, and I've thought a lot about this since being an adult. I certainly did not have grand, lofty thoughts about this as a child.
Mm-hmm.
But putting those things together and also being raised by a mom who was very conscientiously into Black culture as far as literature and drama and poetry and all of that. So that combination of things made me love being Black, made me surrounded me with affirmation of my Blackness at home and at church and at school. So I went to a predominantly Black school. And so you can imagine the young teachers coming out of their teacher education programs in the 60s that were going to teach in predominantly Black schools. So all of them weren't, amazing and into what they were doing, but fortunately for me, many of the ones that I remember did that. And so a question that I started thinking about as I got older and realized that my experience was very unique and different from what many people experienced. Many people's experience was completely segregated, especially at church. And there were lots of people that were very interested in how were we able to do what we did. So I was interested in that too. It's like, seems pretty easy to me, we just go to church and we love each other and all of that. And I in my time of doing more study and doing anti-racism work and having these conversations in lots of different places, but a lot of times with people from faith communities, with people from Christian communities, my experience is wildly different than most people. And so most people I have found just did not have conversations or experiences around race that either were not like a one-off or they were just always bad or uncomfortable. Um, and and so that's where I got interested in thinking about it. And I lived for a little bit of time in that tension thinking, which is what many churches, especially in the 80s and 90s, maybe we don't do that anymore, tried to do was sort of this like, well, you build relationships and friendships and you do a pulpit exchange and you do a choir exchange and you have potlucks together and you get to know one another. And all of those things are great. But if we never also talk about the systemic nature of racism beyond people's friendships, you don't really have the opportunity to shift that wider narrative that says, yeah, we live in a racial hierarchy. We have socialized people to know their place, and it looks different in different eras, right? So we used to have the very blatant era with the signs, that you referenced, and the legislation and the traditions that people sort of knew, okay, this is white space and this is other than white space. This is Black space, or this is, all of those kinds of things. Um, but until we know how those were put together, it's really difficult to think about and devise strategies for shifting it into something different. And that's the thing that I'm really interested in. And I think that that's the thing that critical race theory helps us do. And we were talking earlier about, and even the setting for why is this the bad thing to talk about? The reason it becomes a bad thing, I think, is because it depends so much, critical race theory depends so much on learning and understanding historical context. And we are right now in an era where the teaching of that history is being contained, right? So at public school systems K through 12, where no one was teaching critical race theory anyway, but they were teaching history, right?
Yeah.
Teachers,
Yeah.
educators are being told what books they can use, what words they can and can't use, and even reframing the era of enslavement in our country. And this isn't the first time that this has happened, right? We're in an era where we're doing this, big royal we, I guess. But it's not the first time. Think back, the history of the publishing of textbooks is fascinating, and it is laden with this question of what is the story we are going to tell about this nation. And so the myth of U.S. superiority, like, how do we frame that? Well, we say that those enslaved people learned some great skills, and they had kind masters who let them, I don't know, go to church on and hear preachers tell them, slaves, obey your masters, for this is the will of God concerning you, right? And so when we uncover that history and just just say, so here's some primary sources where people are talking about what their experience was under this system. What do we make of this? Right? One of the most fascinating things. So I have a class that is actually, between the time we met on Monday and when we will meet again. They're looking into some materials about the period of enslavement. And one of the things I flagged for them, I hope I can pronounce it correctly. I won't. Drapetomania, I think. Whatever the word is, what it means is, uh, it was framed as a mental condition that enslaved people had that made them want to run away. So do you hear the framing around that? That if you are an enslaved person that desires to be free and you act on that by running away, you actually have a mental condition.
They pathologized the desire to be
Yes.
free.
And it was
Uh,
illegal to be free. And it was illegal for white people to not, I mean, Fugitive Slave Acts legislation deputized regular white people into capturing people that they suspected of being an escaped slave. And the only thing that arouses that suspicion is, oh, you're a Black person walking around like you're free. You must have escaped. And I have the right and the obligation to capture you. That, without knowing that history, it's so easy to think, well, we just need to get to know each other better. We need to become friends. We need to understand each other. And there's nothing against being friends and understanding each other, but without knowing how many generations of people were nurtured, formed, talk about formation, right? Under this idea of this is what it means to be this kind of person in this society. These are the obligations uh, that I have to the state, right?
so something that stood out from your book, you and Tobin's book, when Tobin was talking about, this is on page 121, how white people need to start by spending kind of doing this like anti-racism work by spending some time talking about being white. I was like, that was helpful for me because it was like, okay, you know, if we're wanting to do work on anti-racism, let's oh my goodness, let's start by at least talking about race and what it means to exist in this world as a white person. Because like you were saying, someone on the street isn't going to look at me and be like, oh, Mennonite, Swiss German background. You know, they're going to be like, that's a white woman.
Exactly.
And it's kind of sad that was like a profound moment, but it was like, we don't spend time, you know, if anything, like you were talking about, like we would go to these anti-racism trainings to kind of check it off the list of, okay, we did our dues, you know, but that isn't the work.
I was just going to say the investigation of whiteness, right, is very disorienting for a lot of people, especially if they've never thought of themselves, like you said, as a white person, or if they, and we would come across this a lot, or if they have this understanding of, you know, I'm a person, so I'm speaking in the voice of a white person, if I may, for a moment. I'm a person who understands, is concerned about racism and, you know, all of these things, and I want to learn about it, but I've never understood myself as a racialized person. And maybe I've even never had conversations about race because I've been told that it makes people feel weird or bad. And maybe I've been told that we should be colorblind. So all of that, like undoing all of that is a lot of work, and it's disorienting. And so I think that, and it's disorienting, and being disoriented doesn't feel great. And we exist in a broader culture that says we should feel good all the time. So I can see it become a particular kind of struggle for white people that is its own thing, just as for people of color, we have a different set of things that we're dealing with in these conversations. And so that thing that we recommend of people need to, like, we all need to do our own work. And a lot of that necessarily has to happen in spaces where we are not together. But a lot of times what people want to do is like, let's all come together and do this work. And there's some internal work that has to happen that will make the other part of it go a lot better. But that understanding of where one is within the racial hierarchy, because there is one, even if we don't believe in the hierarchy exists, and it wants very much for people to situate themselves in it so that the machine can keep running seamlessly. And when we want to disrupt that machine, when we want to dismantle systems of oppression, it really behooves us to understand very well how they came together and how they function. And it takes a lot more than us just being nice to each other to do that.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious where critical race theory might show up in your work as an educator, or also in your work in your book. And this book is about pursuing an anti-racist spirituality. So what is the connection between critical race theory and developing an anti-racist spirituality? And I'm realizing that this is a really big question, so
that's okay.
We could do it in little bites or whatever.
Yeah. So I think the first little bite of that would be in our faith communities, we tend to this idea of formation, right? And it happens in lots of ways. It happens as we are the gathered body on a regular basis, right? And we We practice things together. We sing together.
Mm-hmm.
We pray together. It shapes us into a people, right? We have these communal practices, and then we also have practices that we do when we're apart. And what we have wanted to do in this book is Tobin and I think out loud with each other about how we have experienced doing anti-racism work, but then also thinking about how we are formed by our context outside of church. And so the conversation that you and I were having earlier about how knowing our history helps us understand how we got here, that's a formation story too, right? That contextualized history that begins to answer the question, how is it that so many of us grew up in racially segregated neighborhoods? And growing up in those racially segregated neighborhoods was a kind of formation, right? It says, this is who lives here.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we even have a language for it, right? We talk about the metaphor of across the tracks, right? And
yeah.
there may not be literal tracks, but we understand what that means, where the other people live, where the not us live. So we wanted to be thinking about shifting a narrative and becoming and living into anti-racist norms and values. What are the formations? What are the practices that we need to engage in on a regular basis as individuals, but also in the context of community that helps build towards that? And one of them is simply the thing that we talked about earlier in our conversation, understanding our racial identities, and that includes white people, understanding their racial identities and talking about that and thinking about it in ways that previously we may have been told, no, we don't talk about that. We don't think about that. Or maybe just by the omission of those conversations, we have learned or we've seen the discomfort, right? There's, I won't remember the name of the scholar off the top of my head, but there's just been some really interesting work done around white racial formation. And one of the scholars who does this work, she did her study of with white people who wanted to live into an anti-racist vision. And one of the things that she asked them about was to think about when did you come to your understanding of yourself as a white person, and what was that like for you? And people had distinctive childhood memories of like noticing someone who wasn't white and saying something about it and being shushed, right? And so that taught them, oh, we don't name race. We don't notice race. And then other people being told, everybody's the same, so we're just going to treat everybody the same. Race doesn't matter, right? And then of course there are people who were told, who were formed in the context of, yes, we don't talk to them because they're bad, evil, all the other things. And so just thinking about how that, where the scholar's work went on with this was to then ask them to also remember when they decided, and I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember her exact language, but what kind of white person they wanted to be, right? So in the context of racism exists, and this is what it looks like, and here's how people participate in it, here's how white people participate in it, because these are all white people that are in this study. When did you decide that you're not participating in that, you want to do something different. And I think it's that kind of consciousness of, yes, there was definitely a formation process that happened in a number of different ways, whether it's what people explicitly said to a person, whether it's implicitly, like we just never talk about it. And if somebody raises it, they're like, no, we don't talk about that. So it's
We
doing,
don't talk about Bruno.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, exactly. And yet Bruno's
Yeah.
got a narrative, right? Bruno's got stuff that has happened
Yeah.
that needs to be talked about. I love that movie so much. Anyway,
I know. It's so good. Yeah.
but yeah, so
No,
that's the aspect of it that we wanted to just explore and unfold and think about.
yeah. No, that's really helpful. I had a pastor friend who I've just met her. And this was at convention, and we were walking to dinner, and this is like one of my first conversations with her. And I was with another pastor friend who they were related, and she asked us, she's like, so what anti-racism work are you doing right now? And I was just like, oh, that's a really good question. And I loved I was surprised, but I loved the kind of frank, like, and like the assumption
Yeah,
that we as white women were doing anti-racism work.
yeah.
And it's just like stuck with me. Yeah, I appreciated the kind of frank
Yeah,
bringing it
and
up.
it's that moving into the of courseness of it, right? Of course,
Yes.
this is
Yes.
something that we're thinking about and talking about. Just as in our faith communities, of course, we are doing these things while we are the gathered body at worship, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if we're doing something different, we take the time to say, we are doing this because it's like the liturgical seasons. Like I remember,
Mm.
I remember in my master's program, at the time I was pastoring, and I I asked my professor, one of my professors once, like, when you're in seminary, like your head explodes because there's all these things,
Mm.
and I said, well, what do we do with this, in a
Yeah.
sermon? Because, when you're a
Mm.
baby seminarian and a baby pastor, you just want to like throw your Greek and all the things. And and
So
he
true.
he said, you just tell the story. And
Mm.
that's part of our formation, is that we have these stories, we have these narratives that we tell over and over again
Mm-hmm.
because there is something, because they are formative for us.
Mm-hmm.
And it's and what hopefully what we experience throughout however many liturgical seasons we are given, hopefully that unfolding, that we're not coming to it just as, oh, I love this story, let's hear it again. But each time we hear it, it's like, oh, at this point in my life, this is what I'm noticing, or this is what I'm feeling deeply, or this is who I'm connecting with in this narrative, because I've had another season of living and experiencing the world that I exist in. And yeah, and so I think that the seasonal aspect of formation, that there's a deep wisdom in that as well, that we wanted to grab a hold of, um, because it's not a once and done. I checked it off the list, I did my training, I'm good, but I
Uh,
started the
yeah.
journey. Yeah.
I hadn't connected that to like our biblical formation is constant and ongoing. How is
Hmm.
our understanding of race constant and ongoing? And I love that advice of tell the story. I had a pastor mentor that she told me, like, when I get stuck, I tell myself, and maybe it was from the same source, I tell myself, tell the story. Tell, if you're stuck in a sermon, like just tell the story.
Tell the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. So I wonder, like, we've gone on our own journey on this oh, that was really cheesy, but whatever, on this podcast episode. But what is something that you would want, like, the listeners, the baddies, as we call them, to take from this episode? Like, what about CRT or pursuing an anti-racist spirituality, or this confronting this discomfort or resistance with white people about talking about race? Or we have a lot of things. What is kind of the core that you want people to take from this, or any advice or resources?
Yeah, one of the things that I have to remind myself is that most people don't think about and talk about race as much as I and the people I hang out with do. And so for those of us that are in that place, like, just remembering that that it's a process. And then for people who are elsewhere on that spectrum, for people who have, learned that, oh, it's uncomfortable, or, oh, that's not something that I should be talking about, or it's to use the language to talk about race, to have to, if you're just starting this journey, or it still feels a little scared or weird or whatever, to actually say the words, right? Because it is that thing of, when you're learning a new language, whether it's like the jargon of your industry, or you're literally learning another spoken tongue, there's a difference in reading it and thinking about it inside your own little head, and then talking about it, or using the words and using the language. And I think that that's so important, to help all of us sort of get over that hump of, I'm scared I'm going to say the wrong thing, or and you probably are. I certainly have. But the only way we learn is to practice, right?
Yeah.
And so that's probably the biggest thing. And I would say having conversation partners, it's died down a little bit, but I'm remembering the summer of 2020 after George Floyd was killed, and it was the first summer of COVID. And so lots of us were, our regular routine was disrupted, and we weren't gathering in physical spaces, but we were gathering online. And I just remember seeing, people react to what happened in Minnesota, and people sharing their reading lists, and there was just all of this energy around it, and there was conversation. Like, people were talking about what had happened. They were talking about police brutality. They were talking about how COVID impacts marginalized communities in a different way than it does from centered communities. And so there was a lot of energy around that for valid reasons. Many of us suddenly had time that we didn't have before. And our primary way of connecting was in digital spaces. And I think that that there was a lot of good that came out of that. I do wonder, like, where, like, I wonder if anyone's done a study of, like, did anything change, or are we back in this cycle? We don't talk about those things anymore. But I would say reading, but not just reading, having conversations, and having conversations not only with people who are different, than ourselves, but in our own communities, like using the language and getting comfortable with just talking about race. because
Yeah.
that's a huge, um, it just, for a lot of people, it's just uncomfortable for things that we've talked about earlier because they've been shushed or told, we're all colorblind now or we're post-racial, but we are also in this place where there's active pushback on we're not going to talk about it, we're not going to teach it, we're not going to subject. I mean, honestly, I think what's behind a lot of this is we are not going to subject white children to feeling bad about this history, right?
Yeah.
That is what I certainly have heard people say, well, you're just trying to make me feel bad for being white. No, I just want you to understand like what we have inherited because of this history. That's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, what do you say to the teachers who want to teach history and they are confronted with this pushback from parents
Yeah,
and
I
administrators
I
and
want to say keep your job. You know, if you want to keep your job, then like educators are smart and they will figure out ways. K through 12 people, y'all weren't doing critical race theory anyway, so you're fine. For the ones that, I mean, there's also the book banning that's happening and really
right.
hard conversations in this community over, what books. So I keep thinking about what are the ways. So I keep thinking about supporting the things that I see popping up for people who are making people in places that are making materials available uh,
Mm,
to students. And so look for those places where those of us that can have a little library of books that
yeah.
we might tell families about. But I want people like I want people to keep their jobs. Um, and I know that there are educators that are like, okay, this is a system that I can't tolerate anymore, so I'm going to
Mm,
exit myself and go to a place where I can, and that's legit, that's valid. I support that, but I also recognize that everybody can't leave the public school system because we're in a teacher shortage right now anyway.
mm,
And so it's that time where our creativity and our wisdom and our networks um, outside of the systems, because the same thing is happening in public colleges and universities,
mm,
right? Private schools, we're kind of okay, I guess, for the moment. But we have to be really creative. We have to be creative and we have to build support in the places where there is active support for suppressing knowledge. We have to be just as active in our support for policies and legislation that lets us teach and learn in ways that are liberating for everyone.
mhm. One of the ways I see my faith or ideas of divinity or spirit bubbling up are the ways that kind of this suppression or the powers that be how it ends up backfiring, like
Mhm.
when they were banning the book Anti-Racist Baby or How to Be Anti-Racist, how it topped the number one
Yeah,
charts of being sold. Like the more it's like when you're in a pool and you have like a big beach ball and you try to push it down, and the farther you
exactly.
push it down the higher it jumps back up. I'm like, I don't
Exactly.
know, there's something there that feels kind of holy. um
Absolutely.
well, thank you so much for yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And where can people find your work, Regina?
Yeah, probably the best place would be to go on the GC website on my faculty page. I On my social media, I'm either lurking or looking at what my kids are doing. Like that's the only reason I'm on
Yeah.
Instagram. see what my children are doing. And
yeah, that's awesome.
yeah, but I don't have a big online presence in terms of doing things on my own. Um, I'm connected to the Roots of Justice community and Wider Stand, which is another anti-racism community, and so those cohorts, those collaboratives, are places where those are friends and people I trust and people that are doing the work, and so looking into what's happening there, and of course, people can buy the book.
I was gonna say it if you didn't, so I'm glad you did. Would it be okay if I ended this episode with a blessing to you and all of our listeners?
Absolutely.
Okay. Regina and all of you baddies out there, may you go from this episode energized to continue, further deepen your work on reckoning with your own relationship with your own race. May you work towards developing an anti-racist spirituality and connect to that spark of the divine and holy in this work. Amen.
And
that's all for this episode of Called to Be Bad. Keep being your bad, beautiful selves, and I will see you next time.